Hello and welcome to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi show. You might remember me from the previous Trinity radio video as the guy on the left, also known as Joe. And down there is Dave, also known as the guy on the right. But today we've got two new people with us, or at least new to any of Braxton's audience, and that is Luke and Phil. So maybe it'd be good if they introduce themselves to you. I know our regular viewers know who they are already, but Luke, would you like to take it away and just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Luke, also known as Bearded Heretic on Twitter and YouTube. And PlayStation. It's my gamer tag now. I am an atheist, and I we're going to talk about definitions. I don't know if we are. I subscribe to the belief that gods do not exist. A sense of atheism, thanks to these lovely guys here showing me the light. My main kind of knowledge base, I suppose, is in psychology. I have a master's in psychology, and I work in mental health field. So that tends to be the kind of route I go down when having these discussions within these streams. So yeah, and I also have my own channel, which you should go check out afterwards.
You most definitely should, and also follow him on Twitter.
Yeah.
And Philip, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself as well?
Oh yeah, I'm Philip, and I'm pretty much like a random person that enjoys sort of philosophy of religion and stuff, and talks with people on the internet, I guess. And that's how we all met, and that's how we started to do all of these things. And it's been a very, very productive and very enjoyable ride since then. Otherwise, I have a degree in design, and I do sort of graphic design and stuff. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Awesome. And Dave, I mean, maybe you should just quickly introduce yourself as well, just for any of Braxton's audience who don't remember you from last time, and a little bit about your qualifications.
I'm Dave, and I know nothing. No. I'm Dave. I'm one of the originals of the Fresh Air Sci-Fi streams. And Braxton's video was one of the first that kind of did quite well without being an invited guest. And I love having these kind of discussions and meeting people like Philip and Luke. And I've got a master's degree, and I'm actually quite eloquent, apart from this evening.
That's right. Actually, you got 2 degrees in philosophy, and you're doing a bachelor's of science in computing as well, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right. I've got a BA in philosophy and psychology, MA in philosophy, and like you say, doing the BSc in computer science.
I mean, amazing. You guys are all really well qualified to be here. I'm just tech support, basically. Yeah, I'm a programmer / analyst by trade. So I find the things, the logical things, the analytical things, they come quite naturally to me, and other bits really don't. But I love these sorts of conversations, and I'm sure through Braxton's video we will be finding out a little bit more about our positions on various topics like we did last time. So I think we should quickly switch things into Be Right Back, and I will get the screen up. Are you guys ready, or is there anything else you wanted to cover off first?
No, that's good.
Cool, awesome. 1 second. All right. Sorry, that took a little bit. Just going to bring stuff up now. I've got the screens up right now, so if there are any comments that are worth bringing up, can someone let me know, and I will switch screens and display them on screen. But this is Trinity Radio, 10 questions for atheists in 2021.
Last year, I made a video, 10 Questions for Atheists. That's in a playlist that has 12 episodes, as I listened to what atheists said and then interacted with that. There were a lot of responses, and I still get responses to this day from that video. Now, admittedly, there were some things in that video that might have been tongue-in-cheek, but I genuinely wanted to hear the answers to those questions. Quite a few atheists seemed to appreciate that I was trying to understand their positions in a greater way, but many still didn't think my questions were genuine. A lot of people also thought that I was too wordy for the question to come out in a precise way. So here I'm asking these questions as simply and concisely as I possibly can and without any snark whatsoever. I genuinely want to know the answers to these questions. Question 1.
Makes nice change.
If you have a deconversion story from any world religion, would you mind sharing that story? If you grew up in a non-religious household, what was it like to experience being around other people who were raised religious? Question number 2.
Right. So, Luke, do you want to start us off on this one? I mean, I think Dave and I have already answered like a question like this before, so we'll come at the end with our answers, and we'll do you and Philip each time first with your answers, and then Dave and I can fill in ours.
Yeah, no, that sounds good to me. So I guess I don't have necessarily like a deconversion story per se. I grew up in a pretty secular household. I would describe my mum more as agnostic. Like she tends to favour the, and then I mean I know like the colloquial sense of like someone who thinks there must be something but doesn't know what it is, kind of thing. So my mum was more like that, and I think my dad was more. I mean, he described himself as a Taoist, so I don't think he had any kind of actual like supernatural beliefs, but he kind of liked the philosophy from that side of things, I think. So it was pretty secular, but I did go to a C of E school, so that's Church of England school, which is like the main church in the UK, and that. I mean, I always describe C of E as like Christianity light. It's kind of like people who want to be religious but don't want to do all the religious things per se. You know, I'm sure there's going to be some people that disagree with me, but so it wasn't strict, but we did have a lot of people come in and describe things like the Trinity. We had people coming in and describing things about God and how God worked, and we had assemblies where religious like kind of allegories were shared and stuff like that, and tales of Jesus, and I think the Old Testament was largely left out. There was a few things about like Noah's Ark and stuff, but it wasn't really. It was more of a like seen as a poetic story rather than a literal reading of history. So yeah, that kind of stopped probably around the age of, like, I started to question it around the age of 9, I think 9 or 10, where I was just like, this doesn't make much sense to me, like, where is God, kind of thing. Then I became more agnostic, and then it was really when I was like 18, when I went to university and started doing more around evolution and more about science and stuff like that, that I really became an atheist. And then so my dad passed away in 2012 when I was 19, and then that was kind of like it for any kind of religious views, because I felt like I had to take a stand on it, because I couldn't go on believing that he might be somewhere but he might not be somewhere. I had to be strict with myself, so I did a bit more research into religious views, and it didn't make much sense to me, so I decided that I believed that God didn't exist, although I described it as lacking a belief in God for a long time. Then yeah, that's kind of been my journey. So it wasn't really deconversion, it was more just like gradually pulling away from it over time.
And you'd say you'd never in the beginning had a particularly strong belief or tie to religion in the first place?
No, I mean, I went to Sunday school, and I went to a CV school, and like I believed in God, but I didn't last very long. So I wouldn't say as like somebody who was making decisions about stuff, like somebody who had the capacity to make that decision. I've never really believed in God, although I've not always been an atheist.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. And what about you, Philip? Is your story similar?
Actually, I grew up religious. Although, like, it's not like it was. It's not like my whole family is religious or religious in a heavy way. It's more like a part of my family is, and like especially when I was younger, like a child, I connected very much with, for example, like my grandma, and she's very religious. She's still very religious, although not like, I guess you still have to distinguish between the way, you know, what very religious means in the United States and what very religious means sort of around these parts, right? It's still like, although she you know, like religion is a big part of her life, I wouldn't say that she holds to any of the views that, you know, usually get ascribed to very religious in the United States, right? She's like very yeah, sort of chill in this sense, if you could say so. But like I remember as a child, I was pretty involved in all of that, and I went through the entire Catholic sort of sacrament chain, I guess. But like at some point when I was when I grew up, essentially, I then started to question things. I remember certain like things about even when I first got, I think it's the Eucharist, right? Like the thing, I don't know how to translate the terms into English, but it's like the thing that you take as a Catholic, you know, during Mass.
Yeah, when you take
In the Christians, yeah, exactly. Anyway, it's the thing that symbolizes the bread, right?
The body of Christ and the blood.
Exactly, exactly. And like I remember at the time, like for example, my grandma was like describing how impressive that thing is when you take it, right? That you really feel Jesus enter sort of your mind, and you know, the Holy Spirit and stuff like that. But I remember being quite disappointed when I actually, because I was very excited for that, and then like it sort of I was a bit disappointed because I didn't feel any of that, I guess. Although I expected something more, I guess. But then, I went on believing for a while, mainly because it was easier, I think, right? I didn't really question things, right? It was just sort of the norm. And, but then at certain points, I just grew out of it gradually. I was, for a while, I would describe myself probably as what people would say sort of spiritual. I don't know exactly if that is the appropriate term, right? But it's not like I believed in anything supernatural, I think. Maybe sort of like for a while in some sort of like afterlife or maybe reincarnation and stuff like that. But I didn't believe in sort of the Christian God or any of that for like from the age of, I guess, 12 or something like that forward. And then, you know, at some points then I started to call myself an atheist, you know, largely by sort of finding the online atheist community, I guess. As Luke was saying, right, I also used to describe myself as sort of a lack of belief atheist, but then sort of I dig deeper and then I change my mind on that. So yeah, I would say I'm still an atheist. Don't get me wrong, but yeah, I would define it differently.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now, Dave, your story is a little bit different to ours, isn't it? Because you were actually raised in an atheist household.
Yeah, my parents weren't religious at all. Like, they never sent me to Sunday school. They didn't really talk about God or anything like that.
And your main interaction with the religious people was and thinking about God was actually quite a bit different, because you're coming at it from the other side, and people were questioning you, weren't they?
Yeah, I mostly heard about the Christian God growing up because that was basically the dominant religion where I was. And it would be people coming up and asking me as a kid questions like, well, why don't you believe? Like, why don't you know these things? And it seemed weird that they would think it was weird that I didn't. Do you know what I mean? Because I figured there must be other parents like mine. And because all my parents' friends were sort of secular, I didn't interact with religious people through that either. So it just all felt kind of normal.
Yeah, I mean that's really different to how I experienced things growing up. I think my story is kind of similar to Luke's. So I still don't know how religious my mum actually was. or is. But I know my nana was Catholic and my aunt is quite religious, although it's generally not something that's spoken about. But I grew up going to a Christian private school. We had to say the Lord's Prayer every day, sing hymns, sorry, my computer's just saying my audio software needs to update. No, I don't want to. I'm really hoping.
Ooh, private school.
Right, let me see. Move that just out of the way for now. Sorry about that. So yes, I was going to private school. I had to say the Lord's Prayer every day. We were singing hymns. Every day we'd have a moral story, quite often from the Bible, although sometimes it was an Aesop's fable or something like that as well. But the science education was a good science education, at least from what I can remember of it. It was as accurate as it would be as a primary school. I carried on going to these sorts of schools at my senior school as well, but I think I started questioning things around being 8 or 9. And I started thinking about things and I started having questions. And the more I questioned things, the more I found that people couldn't answer my questions. And the more I was told, oh, you just have to accept this. And, but talking about conflicts with the Bible and science and this, and just, no, you have to just, accept it, or it's just a metaphor. And everything sounded like an excuse. But I actually went in and out myself of various different religions. I'd say I would be agnostic about something, and then I'd get really interested in reading up on like the Norse gods or something like that, and runic magic, and I got really into a bit of Wicca for a while, and the Celts, and I was exploring around because I still felt that there had to be something. There was something in me that was, because I'd been raised with this opinion that there had to be something, there was a big pull from me where I felt, there definitely has to be something. But then more and more questions. I came back, I went to boarding school, had to do Sunday service, the religious studies, and, I'd speak to them again. And the more I questioned things, the more I found myself moving into a position where I believed that there were no gods. And it wasn't until I came online that I heard the lack of belief definition. Now, I came online because I met a young earth creationist at work, say about 10 years ago or so. And I remember coming online and saying, and someone correcting me, no, atheism is only a lack of belief in gods. That's what it is. Yeah, and I got caught up with it. I probably became a bit of a keyboard warrior, wanker atheist for a while. So I'm pretty much the same without being the keyboard warrior. But I now also hold to atheism as the proposition gods do not exist. So, yeah. You guys ready for number 2?
Yeah.
Were raised religious. Question number 2. Is there anything that Christian apologists or philosophers bring that you actually do consider to be good evidence for God? If not, how do you define evidence?
Okay, so this is something that comes up quite often on our streams, conversations about evidence. So, Philip, how would you, first of all, define evidence?
Can I interject just quickly? I just find his question interesting because he asks if there's any good evidence and then asks you to define evidence.
Yeah, that's why I'm attacking it from the other end.
So interesting.
Yeah, so I would define evidence essentially as anything, any sort of fact or data that sort of raises the probability of a given hypothesis being true, essentially, right? So if you take theism as a hypothesis, that at least that God exists or something like that, any sort of observation that we can make that you would expect if theism were to be true, that sort of raises the probability in a way that theism is true, sort of in an abductive way. So that's roughly how I would see evidence.
Do you think it has to be a hypothesis? Do you think that it's something that has to be testable? Because a hypothesis has to be testable.
I mean, I take hypothesis, I guess, more broadly. It's just sort of a statement that would sort of explain something about whatever you want, right? So a hypothesis about, for example, how the universe came into existence or something like that could be sort of theism, or you could also say a hypothesis about what exists in reality would also could be also seen as theism in a sense. So I take that generally speaking, and I don't think I take, I guess, a different view than some people about sort of falsification as well. I do think that theism is falsifiable, at least in some sense of the word falsifiable. It depends on what you mean. If you mean by falsifiable that you have to have an observation that, if met, would make the hypothesis false, then theism is not falsifiable, I think. Although you could argue that certain deductive arguments falsify theism, and I definitely am sympathetic. I do think that, for example, hiddenness arguments are quite powerful against theism, and in that sense, probably that's the closest thing to a sort of absolute level of falsification, in my opinion. But I could also see falsification on a spectrum, essentially as a gradient, right? There could be observations that are not expected if we assume theism, and those would count as evidence against theism. And in this sense, there are observations that could make theism less likely, and that is also a form of falsification, although not as strong. And so, that would be roughly my view on what it means. And when it comes to the question of if there's good evidence for God, I don't think so personally. I do think that there is evidence, right? And that's why I, among many people here, I guess, push back against atheists that like to say that there is no evidence for God, because there are certain things that we would expect if theism were true. But I do think that these are, maybe as a standalone, they could be seen as good evidence. But if you dig deeper, then you find that the very thing that is usually presented, in the details, actually, the details are not as we would expect them if we assume theism to be true. So, for example, maybe you could argue that we would expect moral agency given theism or stuff like that, but then we wouldn't expect, or for morality to be a thing in general. That's something that we would expect given theism, I guess. But then you wouldn't expect certain things about morality to be true, certain evils to be the case, for example. So it's I personally, I don't know if I would say that there is good evidence for theism. There's definitely evidence, and maybe it's also I'm open to the possibility of me just misunderstanding certain things, but I don't find theism to have particularly good evidence.
Would you say there are some arguments that you might say you found strong until you looked into them more? That there are some at least good arguments. They're not as good as the arguments against said arguments, otherwise if you'd be a theist. But would you say there are actually some half decent arguments at least?
Oh yeah, I do think that they're so. First of all, I do take theism as a respectable position, right? In a sense that a position that you should engage with and shouldn't dismiss. And there's definitely some very, very, very smart people that argue for the truth of theism, and it's very hard to dismiss the whole thing as an irrational thing if you really get into the depth of this conversation, in the philosophical sense conversation, I guess, because there are some very smart people behind this and that put out some very impressive arguments, very rigorous arguments. So I guess maybe from this perspective, I would say that there are some decent arguments for theism, but I do think that overall, as you said, they are overweight by sort of other arguments for atheism or other considerations. Or that they are in some ways flawed. This is a very broad statement. I could go into details but I don't know if this matters for every argument. I think we're going to get to this later on in the video.
Fair. What about you, Luke? Do you have any different take on evidence? And if not, move on to if you think there are any good arguments.
So no, I guess I agree with Philip on his definition of evidence. I just see it as anything that increases the chances that something is true. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you make a statement, and then if you provide an argument or something physical that thing is true, then that's evidence, right? You know, if we take it to the court of law, like so many atheists love to do, an eyewitness who is either lying or mistaken is still evident.
Mm-hmm. That's fair.
Right? Whether it's good or not is the question, right? So, yeah. So you know, basically any argument that someone brings up for theism is providing evidence for theism, right? In terms of that being good evidence for theism, I'm a bit torn. I think that there are certainly some good arguments. None of them convince me because I think that they're outweighed by. So maybe there is good evidence, but the evidence on the other side outweighs it considerably for me. Like it's so much better in my opinion.
You'd weigh it. So this is good and this is better.
Yeah, exactly. The explanation provided by the evidence for non-theism is better than the evidence provided for theism, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, that's why I'm an atheist, obviously. So I think some of those arguments, I think something like fine-tuning is a very good one because I think that it's almost like, you know, there is no current explanation for why things are say, for instance, laws of physics act in the way that they do. You know, I think the why questions are probably the ones that stump most scientists because science tends not to answer the why questions; it tends to answer the how questions.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I don't think their explanation for those whys is any better than the explanations for scientists' whys that are just as hypothetical. So, for me, it's kind of like, you know, if somebody says, "Oh, why is the universe tuned the way it is, supports life?" Someone says, "Well, clearly there's a being that has adjusted the parameters to fit this thing. Like, you know, it's adjusted the way that particles work, etc. And finely tuned it." That's no better an explanation than, you know, it's probabilistic. Although probabilistic actually has quantum physics on its side in that instance. So I think that's probably like one of the better arguments that I've heard. I don't tend to look into apologetics too much because I've got you guys for that. So I have yet to hear an argument that's convinced me. Even stuff like, you know, like the argument from contingency, it just seems to be a bit like there's almost a gap there. Like it's a bit like the hard problem of consciousness, right? For me, there's a gap between.
Don't go there, my friend.
It's a bit like no. I'm using the hard problem of consciousness as a hard problem, right? So it's a bit like the hard problem of consciousness, where there's a gap between our qualia and the brain states, right? And that's we're finding it difficult to explain that difference. Okay, for me, something like the argument from contingency has a gap between that and a theistic God. And that gap is too broad for me to be like, yeah, that makes sense. Same with the Kalam cosmological argument. No,
Mm-hmm.
the gap is too broad. So I think, you know, the arguments that tend to be voiced the most tend to have problems with them that I don't see anyone overcoming. And that to me is the real issue with the arguments for theism, and something that doesn't tend to happen in non-theistic arguments.
That's fair. Yeah, good answers. Dave, what about you?
So I define evidence pretty much like Philip does. You know, evidence is anything that belongs to some group that indicates some kind of conclusion and raises the probability of that. But there is all different kinds of evidence, and it's kind of depends on the context that it's being used in. When it comes to religious arguments, I generally use the raising the probability of any given hypothesis, and also the this piece of evidence can indicate towards a particular conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you can also have like personal evidence, philosophical evidence, courtroom evidence, blah, 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 blah. Now, if we're going to go by personal evidence, is there any evidence that I consider good personally? Not really, because I consider being compelling as being part of what it means to be good evidence. Not only does it raise the probability, but it also kind of convinces you to take that fact on.
Mm-hmm.
But is there just evidence? Yeah, there's plenty. I'm kind of fond of the design argument, mostly because it's kind of empirically compelling to look around and see design. Even though you've got this thing underneath, there's still that thing that niggles you that this all looks kind of designed.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I mean, I think all three of you have mentioned what I was going to say as some of my preferred arguments. Like these guys, I'd probably say evidence is something indicative of a conclusion. We may draw conclusions from evidence, but it's not necessarily conclusive. Or something that raises the probability of a conclusion being true or false, because if it's raising the probability of it being false, then it's obviously raising the probability of a different conclusion. For example, I mean, I could tell you right now that I'm holding a pen, and you've got my testimony on that. You have your theory of testimony and say, how trustable am I? I could sort of tap and you go, oh, well, now you've got a bit of audible. You can say, well, that could be anything, but maybe it is. And then I can show it to you and you've got some visual evidence there. And well, I'm not holding it anymore. As for the arguments, I don't think there's necessarily anything good. I do think there are some better arguments that have some weight to them. The ones that I think about, even though I've thought about and sort of come to conclusions where I don't think they work necessarily, are things like the Kalam, contingency, and design. They would probably be some of the better ones, but equally, I still don't think they're powerful enough to convince me.
Should we address the chat as we go, or
that was it. If there's where are we in the chat? I'm happy to go back. It was I just need someone to tell me, because at the moment I've only got two screens.
Is there something specific, Philip, that you wanted to?
Yeah, I guess Matt Dillahunty got brought up a couple times. I'm not sure exactly. I mean, do any of you? Because I haven't heard him talk about like that there is evidence for theism. Like that seems like a thing that I don't ascribe to his character.
No, I've not seen that. So Cafe is saying he's parroting Matt Dillahunty. Matt Dillahunty says there's evidence for God, just not good evidence. I would argue Matt Dillahunty doesn't grasp what even entails evidence for God in the first place. Do
you think, Cafe, that we sort of describe evidence, in your opinion, sort of in a way that you would agree with?
Yeah, I'm not sure that any of us really spend a lot of time watching anything Matt puts out. I
think Matt does have that, because I think a lot of there's a few arguments that Matt has that appears like he shouldn't have them because the people that tend to follow him don't have them. So like I think there's no evidence for God is one of those arguments where we might be ascribing. I think I've seen him say there's no good evidence for God, but there is evidence, and I think that we might be thinking that he says that there is no evidence because a lot of the people that follow Matt Dillahunty say there's no evidence.
Oh yeah, that's why. But like, I don't want to assume anything. Like if he
I think he does say that.
Yeah,
I think he does say that. Yeah, because he tends to be of the mindset that like I'm just not convinced. Like I haven't been convinced of any of these things. So I think he does tend to say there is evidence. It's just not good.
Yeah. And to be fair, there are lots of atheists that just plainly say that there is no evidence for God, and I think like that's what he's referring to as well, because it's simply that I ran into so many atheists that parrot all this stuff. But like, I want to call you out, I guess, a bit on your views that I mean, I'm referring to you, Cafe, I guess, because you mentioned that Wait a minute, I'm searching the comment. Yeah, that cannot accept that there is no evidence for the non-existence of God, right? That's your view. Like that's
so this is this comment.
Yeah.
The truth is that
I
atheists
guess-
cannot accept there is no evidence for the non-existence of God.
Wait,
Yeah.
can someone describe that to me in a way that makes more sense to me? Because I think that sentence isn't really working in my head.
Yeah, so he apparently thinks that it's true that there is no evidence for the non-existence of God. So for the proposition that there is no God, there is no evidence for that proposition. Which I'm going to I guess lay out my views on that. I suppose. Which I think this is just cheap popular apologetic stuff, right? Like that's someone that, like, to me, when someone says that, like, I don't want to assume anything about theists that say this, but usually when they say this, they haven't really heavily engaged with the philosophy of religion on that topic. Usually, I find, and it's just simply so easy to show that is false, right? Like, because if like anything that wouldn't be expected given theism is evidence against it, right?
Mhm.
So suffering in many ways, especially in certain types of suffering, is evidence against it. Hiddenness is suffering against it, right? Like even stuff, such simple stuff as the effectiveness of science. Draper has certain things about that. Suffering and the lack of God's presence while people are suffering is evidence against theism, right? There's plenty of evidence against theism.
The blind
So it's
watchmaker kind of analogy as well. I think that's probably one that's actually like kind of like if we're thinking about physical evidence, the blind watchmaker is physical evidence against a divine being in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so I just like that's just it's. I guess I don't like to see these takes. It usually.
I'd agree, and I think if you get down into specific claims of gods as well, I think that there is evidence that would show them to be logically incoherent, and we would accept arguments and logical inconsistencies and things like that as evidence. If you're asking for scientific evidence about just the general idea that there could be a God that exists and went really wishy-washy with your definition of God, and you went really specific on the definition of evidence, then yeah, okay, maybe you could squeeze that in there, but I don't see why you would do that. I don't think that's necessarily the way to approach that conversation.
Can I add just another comment? I think by Cafe. I think it's a bit further down, but it's about falsifiability.
So
it's whenever an atheist brings up falsifiability, it's just a sign they're unfamiliar with the theology. Unfalsifiability deals with the empirical, not the immaterial.
I'm looking for that one.
Right near the bottom.
An irrelevant question, regurgitating things that derives, the exposed when similar argument. Whenever an atheist brings up falsifiability, it's just a sign they're unfamiliar with theology. Unfalsifiability deals with the empirical, not the immaterial.
I think Faye is on. He's on the right lines, but he's not quite there, because falsifiability requires empiricism. So in order for something to be falsified, well, I know, Philip, you don't agree with this necessarily, because you think that maybe philosophical evidence can prove, for instance, like a good philosophical argument can prove logically why God doesn't exist, for instance, right? That would falsify God.
Yeah, I guess you could argue that is also based on some sort of empiricism, in the sense that it's based on observations about the world, right?
Yeah.
So I guess in this sense, you could argue that is empirical in a sense as well.
Yeah. So falsifiability, I guess, is about being able to prove something wrong, and usually, in order to prove something wrong, like absolutely, you need to. Empirical data is what's required for it, right? So unfalsifiability applies to anything that cannot be falsified. Yeah. So if something is immaterial and can't be falsified, whether it's through philosophical or scientific means, empirical means, then it is unfalsifiable. So I would disagree. I think also unfalsifiability does in fact deal with the immaterial. I think it's absolutely part of that, because you cannot have something immaterial and then it be falsifiable, so therefore it is unfalsifiable, right? Yeah.
No, but I disagree with that, because like there could be something completely immaterial, right? That sort of still has an effect in the natural world that is measurable, right? And if that effect manifests itself, that, you know, if you put it like in a strictly logical schema, right, you could say that even like it doesn't matter if God is material or not, right? Like if it's true that, you know, if God exists, then, you know, there is no evil, stuff like that, and it's sort of observable that there is evil, stuff like that. Or even if you want to make an absurd argument, right? Like let's say that if there is a God, then there are no trees, right, or something like that. Like I know that this is a stupid argument, but it's just for the purposes of illustration, right? If that first part is true and there are trees, which is an empirical observation, right, then that would falsify God, even though God is immaterial, right?
Yeah.
So as long as there is sort of this bridge, it seems to me that in a sense it is falsifiable.
It wouldn't falsify God. It would falsify that effect of God. This is the problem with like measuring scientific things and applying it to an immaterial being, is that, like, say for instance, if you're saying if God exists then prayer should have an effect on the world, yeah, and then you measure it and prayer doesn't have an effect, like there's no effect of prayer. You're not actually measuring whether God exists or not. You're measuring whether prayer has an effect.
Well,
yes, agreed.
I mean, you're definitely measuring, like you're definitely falsifying a God that would make prayer work, right? Like that's
a particular claim about that God. But yeah, no, I get what you're both saying there.
No, because you can have a concept of God within which the very concept of God requires a certain attribute to be true. And if that attribute has this sort of implication, then by denying that attribute, by sort of showing that the attribute is not there, then you're literally showing that, you know, the very concept of it cannot exist, because, you know, that concept is required for God to be there, right? Like at least for the concept, otherwise it's meaningless.
For that concept of God. So you're not showing that no God exists, but that particular claim of a deity that you were saying.
Sure.
So
but you also have to you have to think about, you know, what it means for you to talk about a deity, right? Because there are a certain number of attributes that when you say deity, when you pronounce that, you have in mind, right? And of course, you could say, "Oh, by deity, I just mean, you know, the river outside of my sort of apartment or something," right? But that, you know, at that point, you have a problem, right? So, I don't think that way. Just to clarify that all concepts of God are falsifiable in this very way, right? But I still don't think that it's fair to say that, you know, God is unfalsifiable in general.
Currently. That's what I would add on to the end. I'd say God is currently unfalsifiable, because there are certain elements of God. So, for instance, like if we're talking about like someone who created the universe, right? If that was the only kind of trait that God required for them to be God, was to be the creator of the universe, then God is unfalsifiable, because no matter how the universe started, if God was the creator of it, then God could still exist.
Yeah, I guess.
See what I mean? So
yeah, but like, look, I guess if God, for example, is a mind, right, which it usually is the case, that God is a mind, right? And you could say empirically prove that, you know, in order to have a mind, you have to have a material brain or something like that, which I guess is not going to happen. You know, sort of like definitively prove that. Right?
That's a black swan fallacy, isn't it?
Exactly. That's why I put the caveat on there, right? But let's say you could do that, right? And even though it's just the creator of the universe, then it would be falsified, right? Even though it's at the beginning of the universe. If you mean by God that it's sort of an agent that is a mind, essentially. Although, like, I don't think that is feasible because of the reasons you gave, right? Because you could always say that God's mind is different, right? That it's not the same, and you know, any observation that you make about the minds in physical beings is not going to apply. But then it just, you know, gets you to the question as to what you mean by mind and what you mean by agent at a certain point.
This is why I'm not convinced. Yeah, because God is a bit like smoke in that sense. Like you can test all the physical attributes, the world's physical attributes that God has, and say none of them have an effect. Like prayer doesn't have an effect, evil exists and evil shouldn't exist if God exists, etc., etc., right? Then people will still find a rationale for why God can still exist.
Oh, yeah.
That's the element that makes him unfalsifiable.
That's moving the goalpost, though,
Sorry.
isn't it?
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
changing
Can
the
I
claim.
jump in?
Yeah, Dave, go for it. Go for it.
Unwise man.
Yeah. Joe's right. You're moving the goalposts. But as Philip was saying, if Agent X relies on property Y to be true, and it's a sort of if and only if this property is true does this God exist, and you show that this property doesn't exist or is false, it shows that particular claim to be wrong. That's true, but that's the particular claim under review anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but then there's also another thing, right? You could say that for literally any empirical observation ever, right? Anything that you consider empirically to be proven, right? To be proven false, to be proven true. You could say, you could make the same thing, right? The person that is proposing that could say, oh, well, all the tests that you were doing were flawed because they were using the wrong sort of.
That's literally what happens in science. And this is exactly what happens. It might be like, well, toast causes cancer, right? For instance, and then people were like, well, maybe you were burning your toast a little bit too much, and then they do more tests, and then they realize that this certain type of toast doesn't cause cancer because it's not burnt, and this does, and then they're like, well, actually, maybe it's the type of bread, and then it just keeps going down this like rabbit.
Exactly.
That's the entirety of science.
Exactly. That's my point, though, right? Like that you could always say that the original. Well, but you haven't disproven that sort of all versions of the toast causes cancer claim is wrong, right? Because they're just going to modify it in such a way that well, this particular version is the case, right? And then it sort of trickles down to nullify all of your observations essentially about it.
This is type of stuff I see. It tends to be like, God's not gonna answer prayers in the way that we expect them to be answered, that kind of thing, etc. Or he's got a bigger plan that kind of baffles us or works in mysterious ways. And those tend to be the reasons for why empirical evidence doesn't hold up. And it is, for me, it's a cop out, and I think that that's the very reason why I'm not convinced. But I guess I think that there is an idea of God which will only be able to be falsified when we have better technology.
Yeah, I guess.
And I think it's like more like the deist approach.
I see what you mean. I definitely see what you mean there. Yeah, so I do agree with that. Like in general, I agree with all sort of metaphysical stuff, right? It's usually going to be very hard to find sort of empirical things that are completely going to 100% cut it off, right?
Yeah.
So you're going to have to rely on certain other things, right? But I do think, like, I guess in the weaker sense of falsifiability, that there are certain concepts that can be falsified, and that there are certain even generalist sort of concepts of God that can be falsified in a weaker sense, such that you can make observations that are going to show that they are sort of not likely, or
absolutely
less likely than
agree.
just.
I think we actually agree with each other entirely. Yeah. This whole chat was a waste of time. No, I'm just kidding.
There was a comment from Kimmo that I think should be brought up, because this is something many of us atheists don't say, and there's plenty of evidence to establish theism as a rational position, and I think all of us will say that theists can be rational, and that's something that many of us atheists, especially on the internet, would call anyone who's a theist is irrational or delusional or something like that, and that's just not true. I think we can find many rational theists, and many of them far more rational than those that we talk to on places like Twitter and Facebook. So yeah,
I've met a ton of rational theists, and like a ton of rational theists that I would consider more rational than a lot of the atheists I've ever interacted with as well. So like I have like a huge amount of respect for the theistic sort of tradition, I guess, in philosophy. But yeah, I don't think it works. But I do think that it's
Yeah, Smack Dab brings up something that we were also just discussing as well. God's concepts range from barely superhuman to utterly otherworldly and everything in between. And I think this is where you two were sort of talking past each other, is the fact that you're talking about a specific claim and showing that, a specific claim of a God can show if there is a necessary component of this God and you prove that necessary component, then that God is proven false, but you're not necessarily proving other claims that there are no gods necessarily. So that's always worth bringing up. Were there any other comments that you think that we need to bring up right now?
I don't think from the chat. I haven't read it in a while, so I don't know if there is.
Icarus is coming in with his sarcasm again. The best argument against theism, which God?
Yeah, definitely, that's a.
I'm glad he put the /s there, just so that everybody knows that he was actually being sarcastic.
Yeah, there are some perennialists in the chat, I guess, but I don't see how that sort of nullifies all the evidence against the existence of God. But yeah,
awesome. Right, okay, I'm going to get on with the next question then, but please let me know if there are any comments, and folks, feel free to, if you've got anything in response to any of Braxton's questions that you want us to say, or you would like us to address based on our comments, please just send a message and tag us all in so that we know that it's there. Right, cool. On with the show.
How do you define evidence? Straightforwardly, I'm a dog person. Here's my dog, Indiana. Dogs, cats, both, or neither?
Go for it. Luke?
They serve different purposes. I think I am more of a dog person. Because I think they're more playful and they're more loyal and they definitely love you and all of this stuff. The standard dog trope.
I think beat our dog and he'll change your mind about all those statements.
I think cats are more indifferent and tend to be, and I've had cats that are actually more loving and stuff, but they tend to be more independent and stuff. You can kind of leave them to their own devices and get cuddles when they want them, not when you want them. But I do think that, I don't know. I think they just have different purposes. I mean, I'm a bit both. It depends on my mood, really. It's a weird question to specifically ask atheists. The real question is, should we have pets at all?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, doesn't it say in the Bible that the creatures are for what we want to, under God, what we want to do with them? There, we are the domain, we are the kings of animals. I can't remember the specific quote. I completely bastardize it, but anyway, Philip, what about you?
Well, I think both is the correct answer, at least for me. I kind of am on the same wavelength as Luke here. I think I've never had a dog, but I have 2 cats, and one is very sort of indifferent, I guess, but the other one is very sort of loving and I don't know how it is with dogs, although I have heard it described to me many times. So and I've always wanted a dog, like as a kid. So I think I have an affinity for both.
Yeah, fair. And what about you, Dave?
I'm more of a dog person. I don't mind cats, don't get me wrong. And I'll have a cat. And we've looked after cats and rescued cats and things like that. But I kind of prefer being around dogs. They're just little bundles of joy, except for our current dog, who Emma will agree is just an asshole, who likes to bully you and pick on you and bark at 7 a.m. and then go back to sleep. Yeah. But we wouldn't do without him because he's awesome. He's a little fuzzy person.
I like it when I see pictures of your dog come up on Facebook and stuff.
Well, yeah, there's the pictures of him like sitting on my face. Just comes up, steps on me, and sits on my face. Yeah.
I myself have always had dogs and occasionally had cats as well. I will say both, but I prefer dogs. by a long way. Although at the moment I only have a cat, and I've had her for about 7 or 8 years. She's absolutely lovely. In fact, I will say she's the only cat that I've ever really loved. You know, I've liked cats before, but this is the only one I've ever really loved, and she's brilliant. And we have a little bit of a language as well. She's asleep at the moment, so she won't respond. But generally, I can if I go, "Brrr," she'll come over to me, and she'll come for a cuddle and whatever. If I just make that noise, she tells me when she wants to go out by going to the door, and she actually makes like an ow sound, different to her normal meow. And there was one time where she got shut in a bedroom, and I couldn't find her for a day, and I'd been cleaning up the house, but I'd shut the door to one of the rooms I cleaned, not realizing she was in there, and she was in there overnight. And then I opened it the next day, and she came out, and she told me off. She was like really engaging me. It was like I've not known a cat to sort of act this way, but she's brilliant, and she's good with my kid as well. She really puts up with her. She's only ever hit her once, which I think is amazing considering what my kid does to her. So yeah, she's great. Are there any comments on that one in the chat, or should we move on? No, that's cool. Let's
Talking
move on.
about brains.
Awesome. Well, we can come to those ones that are not in line with what's going on at the end.
He says he loves cats.
Oh, do you now? Can't see that one in there. Oh, I'll scroll back up later.
Did Jesus exist as a single historical individual? And if so, how reasonable do you think it is for people to hold the position that Jesus did not exist?
So, this is another one that we've discussed before. So
this is kind of a mean question, setting atheist upon atheist.
Yeah.
Of course it is, but isn't that what we do most of the time anyway?
Yeah, we do it anyway. So, yeah.
So, show of thumbs from everybody. Did Jesus exist? There you go. So all of us will say that we think that Jesus exists, or you know, some you know, the historical, not necessarily the more mythicized biblical Jesus, but the character based on someone. So Luke, do you want to take it away by describing how you think, whether you think it's a rational position to hold that that Jesus didn't exist at all?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think it is. Because I don't think that the historicity of Jesus is very well communicated. I think in terms of people just... this is a tough question, because I think the more educated someone becomes in the area, I think the less, or the more vocal someone becomes in the area, and the assertive they become, the less rational it becomes to hold that position. But the average Joe on the street, I wouldn't feel like they weren't being rational if they said, oh yeah, I don't think Jesus actually existed. If that makes sense. Because I don't think that most atheists look into that aspect of the Bible. I think it's a very specific type of atheist that cares and uses it as a rhetoric tool. Jesus just didn't exist. But I think most atheists outside of online atheism think of the Bible as mythology and equate it to something along the lines of like the Greek myths or something. But in my opinion, even the Greek myths, I think we need to think about some of them being actual historical figures. I don't know which ones because I haven't done that much research into it, but I'm sure that there's some people that in Odyssey and the Iliad and stuff that did actually exist, but they were written like 500 years or something after the fact. So you know who existed and who didn't exist was very much lost in that 500-year period. So I think it's not irrational, but people should, if they're going to make assertive claims about the historicity of Jesus, they should do their research before they make those claims.
That's fair.
Otherwise, that is irrational.
What about you, Philip?
Yeah, I guess this is a complicated topic. I find it. So it depends, as always, it depends on what your reasons are and what is your context of understanding, right? But I do think that in general, speaking sort of like on a median understanding of what is going on and on what we know, like more broadly on the topic, I would say that it's very close to being irrational in a sense. Like, I guess it's irrational to the extent that you can doubt anything about history, especially history that is sort of very ancient. Because I do think that, for example, you should add a layer of skepticism to everything that we know about history. Especially the longer back it is, the more skeptical you should be about things in history, I think. As a general sort of indication, right? It doesn't mean that there cannot be very good evidence, even if it's very far back. Maybe even better evidence than for something that is more recent, but we have less evidence for. Right? But as a general sort of guide, I think it's not unreasonable to be skeptical about things in history. But like the thing that bothers me most about Jesus mythicists is that they seem to have they seem to hold inconsistent views about certain things that happened in history, right? Because I do think that the evidence we have for a historical Jesus is pretty much consistent with other very mundane things that we have around the same period of time. And so, like, if you're gonna be skeptical about the existence of Jesus, I think you should probably be compelled to be skeptical in the same way about a lot of other claims in the same time period, right? That are equally similarly supported, right? And that you could pick holes in and be very skeptical about because you're going to say, oh, but this was years later and stuff like that. So I think it's very hard to be like okay with most of the history of that time, but then specifically when it comes about the historicity of Jesus, be like, oh, but wait a minute, this I'm skeptical on this, right? Like I do think that there's tension on that. I will say that I'm not exactly super well informed on this, but another thing that you could say about this, and I think Real Age Theology mentioned this, is that when you don't know something very well, right? And you don't want to look into it, you should probably defer to the sort of experts in the field, sort of to the average sort of experts in the field's consensus opinion, and that seems to be that the historical Jesus actually did exist. So on that layer as well, you could say that it would be rational if you don't want to like dig heavily into it to adopt the view that Jesus actually did exist as a historical sort of figure.
Yeah, that's fair. And I suppose to further what you're saying there about deferring to the experts and the consensus, if there's a few fringe experts with a different opinion, again, if you're not willing to look into it, don't go for the one that just backs up what you want to be true. So on the Jesus mythicism, as you mentioned, it's generally accepted even by atheist historians.
Scholars.
And just because, say, Richard Carrick says, well, no, he didn't exist, it isn't enough of a reason to just go, well, I'm going to go with him. What about you, Dave? How do you think, is it reasonable to hold the position that Jesus did not exist?
I mean, I could see how people could come to believe it if they've not looked into any of this in any great detail. It's reasonable to just sort of say, well, look, I don't really believe anything without physical evidence from back then, or, so I can see how they can get to that point and be sort of reasonable, but I don't think it's a reasonable position from an ideal observer sort of outlook.
That's a fair way to put it. But what about if they then, like Philip mentioned, they hold inconsistent views about things in that time period?
Yeah, there's that, and I also kind of want to bring up what Philip was saying about deferring to experts. In that, a lot of the time there is a kind of inconsistency in the thinking. In that, those same people who are dismissing the scholars will also tell people when it comes to evolution, you should defer to the experts.
Yep.
So in that way, their position isn't reasonable because they're holding contradictory positions in order to hold on to a position that comes from confirmation bias, which again is another problem in reasoning. So it shows that those kind of stances aren't particularly reasonable.
Yeah, and to be, I guess, charitable to people that hold to Jesus mythicism, I think that many of them actually, get into this without even sort of it's through no fault of their own, in a sense, right? Because I think for some of them, they're gonna very deeply examine this question, and it's probably gonna be like one of the few historical questions that they've ever examined, right? Because you usually get told history about the facts that happened, right? But you very rarely actually, okay, but why do we think that this happened, right? You very rarely have that step in your education about history. So this is the first time that they actually get exposed to this, how do we know things about history, right? But they get exposed to it on this particular question. And because they find it so sort of, weak in a sense, because that's just the nature of historical sort of documents and stuff, they find it, and then they think about it, would I believe it if I had this evidence? And then they reason it according to the standards of today, right? Like essentially, would I believe, that my friend yesterday went to the park if he presented the same types of evidence, right? But that's reasoning, comparing it to what we would expect as evidence today, not what we would expect as evidence, 2,000 years ago, right? So there's a lot of this going on, I think, where people just, get, for the first time touch this question, see how, the evidence is, and they don't find it particularly convincing, which I think is excusable, right? Because I don't, you could be surprised by looking at this and be like, oh, well, I don't think this is enough, right? Especially if I compare it to standards of today that we have for sort of murders or something,
Yeah.
But then they don't really look broadly, how any of historical sort of investigations work. And I think that's where they would be surprised if they did that.
No, I think you're right there. When you are comparing it about it at today's standards, you're very astute there in what you say. That is a big part of it. You can't look at something 2,000 years ago and expect the exact same standards as today. Sorry, Dave, I cut you off there.
That's all right. I was just going to say, to further Philip's point just a little bit more, you also have to remember that a lot of these people are coming in through the sort of internet atheism, ACA style of atheism. So they'll have heard only scientific evidence is evidence. Evidence has to have all these properties in order for it to be actually evidence. So they're taking that and applying it to the historical evidence, sort of making a category error in the type of evidence that we should be looking for. So I think along with Philip's talk, this also adds to it. So I can understand how they might come to this kind of position.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Something to add, I think, is just sometimes I think from thinking about it from the other side of things, sometimes there is an overestimation on the quality of the evidence for Jesus's historicity as well. I've heard people say that there's less evidence for Julius Caesar than there is for Jesus, and they're using basically the number of accounts written about Julius Caesar, when actually the amount of physical evidence that Julius Caesar existed is a lot, because there's coins and there's statues and there's memorials and there's stuff like that prove he existed, right? And they're just focusing on the written texts about that individual. And in terms of physical evidence that Jesus existed, there isn't any. We have accounts, and those accounts are backed up by independent accounts from other sources, which means that it's likely that he did exist, right? But in terms of physical evidence, he was not someone that was like a king or anything, so there was no coins or no statues made of him around that time and stuff. He was, just he wasn't a normal person, but he wasn't like in terms of the state, an important person. Therefore, his physical evidence. It's just
that's also what you. Yeah, on that point, that's also something that you would have to bake in, though, right? The expectation of what we would find as evidence, right? If Jesus, let's say that he was a king, right, or something like that, then you presumably would expect to find certain, things that you wouldn't expect given what he was, right? So I guess that's also, the expectations that you have is different for Caesar and for Jesus. So that's another thing that is worth considering. I think another thing that I find very often is that atheists will just say, given that a lot of these things written about Jesus are in the Bible, right? Like a lot of atheists have these very bad, in my opinion, narrative, that whenever they hear Bible, they're just going to sort of blank and be like, oh, that's like, saying that, a Spider-Man comic proves that Spider-Man exists, right? Like that's just the default sort of thing that they go to, right? When in fact, the Bible is a collection of historical documents, right? You can look at it from a historical perspective as well, right? Like those are historical documents. And as with all historical documents, you would expect them, some of them documents at least, to be, full of bias, right? But it's the job of the historian as well to consider these things, consider what the person was like that wrote these things and in what context, and those considerations are already baked in, right? When they consider this type of evidence, but it's still evidence, right? These are still historical documents. You can't just burn them and not consider them because they're Bible, and Bible is like Spider-Man comic, right? That's not how it works. So yeah, I guess that's another thing that I think a lot of contributes to this sort of Jesus mysticism thing.
I think I'd also add that there are probably more accounts for Jesus than there are from other historical characters that we accept exist. I think some of the reason people might not accept that he existed is because there is the mythological element, and because there's this mythological component, they go, well, it's completely all false. And they forget there are some extra biblical accounts that sort of back it up. They also forget that there are other characters that we do accept exist that had a mythical component, but we just don't accept the mythical component. For example, Pythagoras. We accept him. We all know his triangles. He really loved them. But he was actually thought of as a god back then. So there was even a small religion. He had followers who believed in him as a god. But we don't say that, oh well, because he was thought of as a god he didn't exist. We go, well, they were just wrong about that bit. And I think we
like in ancient Egypt, right, you have like countless examples of this, right, like of pharaohs and all of that were considered gods and have accounts written on them about the amazing things that they did. But like it's not like you're going to deny that sort of Ramses exists because there's an account written that he made. I don't know exactly what it would be, but I know that there are certain sort of accounts about wars that he was involved in, stuff like that are sort of like involve these types of considerations. So, I guess it wouldn't be reasonable to reject the whole thing, his whole existence, just because there are these accounts as well.
Yeah, I just want to bring up a modern example. If you like to dismiss an account as false because it's been a person is false or not existing because of a mythological account, think of the Kims of North Korea.
Yeah.
They have a whole bunch of mythology written about them, but yet they clearly exist, and we can see that one of them still exists, at least.
Yeah, good point. Cool. Was there anything more that you guys wanted to cover on this question, or should we move on?
No, I'm good.
No.
Cool.
Not exist. Of your Christian friends and family members, which one would stand the best chance of convincing you or persuading you than the others? Even if you think none of them stand a chance, some stand more of a chance than others, right? Who would that be and why?
Luke?
I don't think any Christian apologetic person is going to convince me, because I think the line of reasoning that they take is too abstract for me to kind of to take on board. I think what would convince me more is somebody who I trust innately providing me with a really solid kind of like personal account. And personal accounts I know are problematic, right? And he said, even if something's not going to convince you, like what's the most likely thing to convince you, right? So it's unlikely that this stuff is going to convince me. But I think that if like someone I know who's a really strong atheist has this account and I have no way of like kind of denying it or something, and I have no reason to believe that they're mentally ill in any way, then that's probably going to be more convincing to me than anything else. If they had good reasoning for why I should believe and stuff, and able to tell me that, I think that would be convincing. I think people like William Lane Craig and others, Daniel Ray, I think they're too far removed from me, and their arguments are usually not that good, in my opinion. I think there's some good arguments, but I think that there's too many rebuttals that just make more sense to me.
Yeah, that's fair. And what about you, Philip?
So I don't know. Like, I think I'm probably like the Christian that would convince me is probably some sort of like a philosopher, I guess. I think that is the route that would work best on me, because I do think that unless the account is like really spectacular in some sense, right? Like that it would be like sort of like a very accurate prediction of some sort, right? That actually comes true, or something like that. That is not like the usual predictions that we have, which are like everything but the things that I mentioned, for example. But like something like that could convince me, I guess. Like from a philosophical standpoint, I think I could be convinced. I like the person that is least likely to convince me, I guess, is the sort of popular apologist that just is overselling everything about his view and just completely misrepresenting everything else, because that's a very off-putting. And I admit that it being off-putting doesn't necessarily correlate with the quality of the content that he is presenting, because it might very well, like, it's not right, but it might be the case that what he's saying, even though it's extreme, is actually true, because there are certain positions, right, that are extreme and yet are true, right? So it might be the case that whatever he's presenting as extreme is also true. I just don't think, like, from what I know so far, like, this is a very gross misrepresentation of the overall sort of scene as I see it, at least. And even as many sort of philosophers would admit on both sides, right? So that seems to me very that's very off-putting. So if you're going to go that route, it's very unlikely that you're going to make progress with me, especially if you then don't actually, you actually show that you don't know certain things, right? Which is very likely for people that present these things. So like that, I guess. So I guess sort of like from a philosophical standpoint, I could be convinced, but yeah, I don't think it's likely that that's going to happen.
That's fair. And what about you, Dave?
Yeah, pretty much the same as everybody else. I'm not really sure any particular Christian is more likely to convince me than any others. Who they are will dictate whether or not I listen to them, or how much I pay attention to them, or whether their arguments are worth considering at all. But the actual them being Christian wouldn't really influence it. It wouldn't really influence my assessment of the actual arguments, or at least I'd like to believe not. Anyway, I'm more likely to be convinced of something like deism or even pantheism.
Yeah, me too, definitely. I think like the best route that someone could take, as I see it right now, is from the philosophy of mind route, right? That's the easiest way I could get to theism, as I see myself. But I don't think that even there it's remotely close to that. So
Right, we're back in the room. Thank you, Braxton, for that. I really enjoyed answering your questions, and thank you, obviously, Luke and Philip as well for your answers to those questions. They've been pretty good. Did you guys have anything else that you wanted to say to Braxton, or ask him any questions or any critiques about his video?
No.
I guess no.
No, what about you, Philip?
No, I don't think so. I don't have any particular questions.
And Dave?
I think I'm going to say what I was going to say.
Okay.
I think what would be nice is if there was more questions that didn't. I feel like some of the answers that he was like thinking he expected certain answers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that maybe that's him challenging his views and seeing whether people would give the answers he expected, which is fine. I think that it would be nice to have some questions that he maybe doesn't have an expectation for the answer.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's just my bias on it, though. That's why I was a bit kind of not sure if I was going to ask it, because
is it kind of hard, though? I mean, you would have expectations with certain things. It's hard not to have an expectation of what someone's going to answer. I suppose if you're speaking about any form of theology online, and you're speaking to whether you're speaking to a Christian or you're speaking to an atheist, you're going to think that they're going to have these particular ideas, and maybe you'll be hopeful that they'll say something different. And I agree with you. There are a couple of questions in there where it was like the one about what do you think it takes someone to become a Christian? And I think that there will be many atheists that will have a very singular view on that. And I actually think that there are many Christians within their own denomination will have a very singular view on what it takes to become a Christian. And that's why you will often get Christians saying other Christians are not real Christians, because they don't hold to the same tenets that they do. So hopefully we gave him some answers there which aren't the standard answers that he'd be expecting. I hope so anyway.
Yeah, I think we have.
Yeah,
I think we're great, but I've got a bias there.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, just going through the chat, is there anyone who's got any questions or comments on anything that we've said tonight that you want us to go into more detail about, or anything that I missed throughout the entire show? I know I have been not as able to keep up with the chat as I usually am. That's because obviously I've had all my screens in use for playing the video and pausing and doing all of that, whereas usually I've got the chat constantly going. In some respects, it was kind of nice not to be as distracted by the chat as I usually am as well. It was nice to be able to focus a little bit more. But yeah, if there's any questions, please get them in now.
I will say one thing to Braxton. No more questions about favorite films, books, movie, TV shows, songs. No more favorite questions.
Yeah. They're definitely hard questions to answer.
That was the most difficult question on the list.
Yeah,
how could he?
I think he did it to break it up a bit and make it sort of lighter,
more friendly.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah. But yeah, that was generally the most difficult question.
Yeah. It would have been better if it had gone, what's the best new TV show that you've seen in the last month or two? And then you'd have probably gone, oh, well, I've seen this one and this one, and they were quite cool. Rather than your favourite of all time. I mean, blimey.
I think you should ask more obscure things like what's your favourite tooth in your mouth?
Why was Midsummer a terrible film?
No, get out.
Yeah.
Still not seen that.
Lucky you.
Do you think it's that bad, Dave?
Yeah.
And you like pretty much every film. You like some absolute shit as well. So for you to say that this is bad,
give it a 9 out of 10. Give it a 9 out of 10.
Blimey.
I'd give it a 9 or 10 feet wide berth.
Oh, Now I definitely want to watch it for both reasons.
You still want to be in the same room as it, Dave. You just don't want to. You just don't want to look at it.
Yeah, and it looks like the chat has gone on to Brexit conversations.
So can I address something that got brought up in the chat? I think this might be a good topic for a future video, if possible.
Yeah.
So there was a big discussion around hallucinogens and sickle experiences earlier on. It's nothing to do with the video that we were watching, and I think it would be worth. I'm not going to answer any questions now because we're wrapping up, but I think it would be worth having that as a topic for a future stream.
So, what sort of hallucinogens and mystical experiences and that sort of thing? Yeah, I'd be well up for that. Should we do it in Holland?
No comment. No comment, Joe. You're gonna get me fired, man.
Awesome. The psychology of Brexit.
No, because all the psychology of Brexit is a bunch of people who weren't going to vote got tricked by a bunch of liars. That's it. If you want to watch about the psychology of Brexit, watch the Uncivil War with Benedict Cumberbatch in. Brilliant explanation of what actually happened. Okay.
Awesome. Did you guys have anything you wanted to add before we sign off tonight?
No.
Okay. Well,
I don't think the only thing I hope, like, I know that this could be. Sorry, go.
No. Say it. It's fine. It's just.
Forget
No. I'm happy for. No. Please say it. Please say it.
It's just that you came in so erratically.
It was like one of those walking away from an argument and just another fucking thing. Those are sometimes the best arguments, though. So, what were you going to say?
Joe, you have to make that into a clip, right? Please.
No, is it?
Sorry for letting go.
No, it kind of feels weird now because it's a bit out of sync with the overall mood in the room right now. What I want to say. So,
were you going to get angry?
I just hope that this whole thing, his whole project, is not going to be used by theists to dunk on sort of like to use it as an apologetics tool, essentially, right? Like a cheap apologetics tool, right? Like that's something that I would want. Like if it's about having discussions and having honest discussions between it, that's fine, right? But I hope it doesn't carry some sort of like gotcha in it, right, against certain people who try to honestly answer these questions. So I guess that's just my final point. And yeah, that's the only thing.
That's more than fair. So the only thing I've got to add is I won't be streaming for a couple of weeks now. So next week my wife goes in for her C-section unless the baby comes before that. So I'm either way I'm going to be out for a couple of weeks. It may be a bit more depending on her recovery and the routines that we get into. We have got some videos planned to come out, and I am going to try and do a few things like SciPhi shorts and all of that, and get them released over the coming couple of weeks, as long as I have time to record them. I know that Dave was saying that he's got an idea that he's planned out, and he's going to try and release a couple of videos as well.
I've got a few on the cards, and now that I have more free time, I'm going to put some work in, and I'll finish off the stream on explanations. And I was thinking doing one on the Epicurean view of death.
Awesome.
Yes, I would love to do that.
It's a fun discussion.
It's a very fun discussion. I have a lot of thoughts on that.
Yeah.
So yeah, there should be some content on the channel, but I won't be here anyway for a couple of weeks. So if anyone's got any requests and things that they want to see upon my return, please let us know, and I'll start having a think about what we can do for the comeback. And yeah, other than that, I just have to say again, thank you, Braxton, for your video. Thank you, Luke, Philip, and Dave for being here tonight. It's been great, and for everybody
It was
who's
good to be back.
Yeah, it was absolutely great.
It was very good to have you here again.
It's a shame. It's a shame that it's the first one back in a while, and then we're off for a couple of weeks.
Hi.
Maybe there'll be a bit of heretic takeover.
Yeah. Do it. You've got full access to. You do. Yeah, all of you have access to stream whenever you like. So
it won't be as technically lovely though. I won't have all the backgrounds and stuff. Like I'll just be like, is the Discord chat thing? That's it.
I mean, technical issues are part of this whole show anyway, so that's fine.
Yeah.
You'll probably find if you do stream without me, there won't be a single issue, and actually the entire problem is me.
You say that, but it was Philip all along.
I mean, I never denied it. I always
exactly.
Said it. So yeah, I don't know why you're still trying to find the culprit.
Awesome. So yeah, and thank you everybody who has been in the chat, interacting, asking questions, conversing with each other. It's been great to see you guys having a good time in the chat as well. And to anybody who is catching the rerun, whether you're listening to the podcast or you're watching the video, thank you for you as well. Please leave any comments wherever you see this video posted. Let us know that you watched it. Let us know what you think. If you've got any critique or anything like that, or you want to discuss some of the points we made in more detail, we'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you. It doesn't have to be on stream. We can do it on Discord or over Twitter or on social media. It's absolutely fine. We love having these sorts of conversations, but we are interested in them being conversations rather than fights. I think that's our only requirement. We'll discuss pretty much anything as long as it is a discussion. So that's it for us this week, and from me for a couple of weeks. You've been watching the Fresh Air Sci-Fi Show, and I'm Joe.
And I'm Dave.
And Luke.
And Philip.
Have yourself a good night, all.
And he's...
Good night, all.
Night, all.
That was fun.
That was